For me, two important parts of Zen practice are intimacy and vulnerability. And so I hope to model some of that in this talk and share why I think it's a really important part of practice. A little bit about me. I think I know just about every one of you on a personal level here. But I'm Tangen, and I came here to Colorado about 4 years ago to start a doctoral program in counseling psychology. And my path to get here was, in many ways, it mirrors my spiritual path. It was very wide zigzags towards some unknown destination. I really had no idea I was going to end up here. And when I was a kid, I wanted to be an inventor, so I'm pretty far off from my original plans. But if there's anything that I've learned in that process, it's that nothing is wasted. Not the years working menial jobs, struggling to make ends meet, or the years working jobs that left me feeling empty. It all got me here, right now, speaking to all of you. And my experience with Zen has taught me about that in my life in general. The whole journey is inseparable from its parts, even the terrible, seemingly joyless ones. With that, I'm going to rewind a little bit. I grew up in a really small but beautiful town in the mountains of New Hampshire, a pretty picturesque place. We had a ski mountain there and a beautiful lake. When I was a real little kid, I was pretty wild. I had endless energy, just insatiable curiosity, and I was extremely extroverted. My parents would tell you that I would talk to anyone, anywhere about anything, and sometimes that was a great embarrassment. I think one of the classics is I would ask people how much money they made because I had no conception of how money worked. So that was, quashed early on, and some of that was probably for the better. But when I watch those old home videos of that little kid, I kind of wonder where the hell he came from, and also where did he go? In some ways, a lot of my adult life, I haven't felt really connected to that. So as I was getting into my school years, I was bullied pretty relentlessly for just about everything. I had very few friends, and the ones that I had weren't even always kind to me. So I was a real sensitive kid. I did not have a thick skin. So everything I took to heart. I took it very seriously. And I frequently came home in tears, just really boggled by how people were so cruel and wondering why it was that was the case. And my parents were at a loss too. They tried their best to support me, but they didn't really know what to do. And one of the problems with growing up in such a small town, my class was like 30 kids. So most of the people that I even went to preschool with, I was with them all the way until I graduated high school. And so when you have that few people, as soon as you get a label on you, it's pretty hard to live it down. You don't get these opportunities to sort of reinvent yourself in other people's eyes. And, because I couldn't understand why I was being treated poorly, I began to really suspect that there is something deeply wrong with me. Because that's the only way it would make any sense. And this is something I see with my clients all the time, is that, it doesn't seem like that's a great thing to believe, but, we're strongly invested in the world making some sense. And so in the absence of an explanation, sometimes it's even best just to blame yourself. So as a result, I withdrew from others. I turned inward, and I was pretty solitary for most of my childhood and teen years. I both deeply feared rejection and I expected it. So I learned to be self sufficient. Here's where another part of the story kind of comes in. Um, I was raised in a pretty devoutly Catholic family, and much of our lives were revolved around the church. And in those early years, I welcomed that. It was what I knew. And there were many people I loved in that church who were kind and caring to me. And for a long time, I left church on Sundays feeling really good. I liked the songs, the family friends, and especially the donuts and sweet tea that would follow Mass. In those early times, it was really more about community than it was about any sort of spiritual path, and that's what I needed. When I was putting this talk together, it's really the first time that I've been able to sort of pinpoint for myself where things started to change with me for church. I previously thought I knew, but this was a little bit of a revelation to me. And I think it really happened around the time of first reconciliation. And for those of you who are uninitiated, this is when young Catholics begin the process of learning how to confess their sins and accept penance for what they've done to seek forgiveness. On the face, that sounds like, a pretty nice thing, right? Forgiveness, that's great. But for me, I began to feel really deep shame for my flawed behavior. Even if it was just like a small white lie or a minor argument with my sisters, I had this sense of a judgmental God, invisibly marking the ledger with every iota of my misdeeds. In a Catholic tradition, there's a large book called the Catechism, which contains a detailed catalog of sins. They've got it all written out. And with how severe each of them are, and really like the punishment, is this one going to get you sent to hell automatically or not? And I would read that book in terror of hell and punishment. So while church had previously been a refuge, with this change, it was every bit the tormentor that my peers were at school. The message was that you're inherently flawed. The fact that I kept sinning made me feel like I was beyond redemption. I was doomed. I came of age during pretty much the worst part of the revelations of sexual abuse within the Catholic Church. And as I grew, I began to feel that there were some really toxic things afoot in the church. And by no means do I want this talk to be disparaging of Catholics or their traditions or the church even. So just want to be clear, this was my experience of it at the time. At the time, I was disgusted with what I perceived as some hypocrisy in putting on airs. It wasn't really that nobody else was a sinner, it's just that most folks made a pretty good show of being pure while still acting poorly in their private lives. And I began to resent the guilt that I felt and the shame. While the church was sort of making me feel that, I was messing up, they were at the same time sweeping child sex abuse under the rug. That didn't seem to square. So some part of me felt that the shame that I was experiencing was undue. And I don't really know where that strength or insight or resolve came from, but I'm grateful for it. And it's what ultimately deconstructed my faith and made me leave the church. So my first real contact with Buddhism was reading Siddhartha. which I think is probably a pretty common experience for a lot of folks. Um, and it was nothing short of a revelation for me. It happened around the time that I was deciding to leave the church. And, what it really struck me was that Siddhartha, he was not willing to accept dogma or, the conventional beliefs at the time. He was like, I'm going to experience the truth for myself. And for me, at odds with power and dogma, this offered kind of a glimmer of hope that I could maybe forge my own spiritual path. In hindsight, I was needing to fill the void that was created from, leaving Christianity. I needed something that would provide a moral compass and enrich my life with meaning. I needed some measuring stick to say, I'm a decent person. In Buddhism, I had hoped that maybe I could do this on my own terms. So I flirted with Buddhism for many years. I was terrible at meditating and I knew it. And any efforts to start a practice were an uphill battle. I sat with the Triratna folks, Shambhala, Plum Village people. I knew that I wanted kind of vaguely to become a Buddhist, but I wasn't sure how to get there. There weren't a lot of models of it in my immediate environment. So, and I think that part of me was kind of infatuated with self-improvement at the time and self-reliance. I wanted to be better. And if I'm being honest, there's a part of me that wanted to be better than everyone else. I felt like I had kind of something to prove. And it's only later that I understand that Buddhism is really deeply relational. So I got into therapy for the first time when I was in my early 20s. And I was finally diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. I got on medication and everything came into focus for the first time in my life. It's not just that I was able to moderate my attention, which, is the problem with ADHD. You can't really control your attention as well as most folks. But I was able to get out of my head for the first time and be present. And the effect that had on my life was nothing short of miraculous. One thing that did for me was that I began to understand why I'd always felt so different as a child and why certain things have been so challenging for me. And that includes meditation, sitting somewhere doing nothing. Yeah, not something an ADHD kid is gonna take to very easily. So this was the start of a long journey towards some self-acceptance. And as it would happen, that therapist that I was seeing had a long history of Zen, having grown up partially in Japan. And he used meditation and mindfulness in his therapy. And when I took to it, said, hey, there's this place, Zen Mountain Monastery. If you're really serious about, keeping with your practice, that might be worth a look. And, I had always had appreciation for Japanese culture and stuff. And, I definitely didn't have any idea what Zen was about, but I definitely thought I did. And so I was like, yeah, that really sounds really cool. I should go do that. So I decided to go there. And my first retreat at Zen Mountain Monastery, it was really powerful. It was one of those intro to Zen weekends. And at first I had so much resistance to the forms and the liturgy, which to me just seemed like the Catholic Church, more dogma. About here, then you do this thing, genuflect. It just seemed all the same to me. And I asked the teacher about it, which was Ryushin Sensei at the time. And he told me, these forms are only meant to help our practice. When I bow to the Buddha, I'm not bowing to a God and worshiping, but I'm recognizing the Buddha in myself and others, recognizing that that's our shared inheritance. And that response was thoughtful, and it seemed to say to me, do with it what you will, it's all just upaya, it's all just skillful means. So contrasting this to my experience in the Catholic Church, which, when I asked questions, I was often chided and silent or told the way it was. In contrast, Zen invited questions. And teachers that I've worked with have, by and large, always been willing to entertain anything. So even that liturgy, which was seemingly rigid and formal at first, were skillful means. They ended up being powerful windows into my own resistance and stubbornness. I remember one of those nights at ZMM, hearing the 4 Bodhisattva vows for one of the first times, and just tears just coming to my eyes. And just how beautiful to know that something is almost impossible, and we'll do it anyways, together. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to save them, as they say it at CMM. And, in that moment, I just felt a deep sense of hope and community. And from my perspective now, I really think it was those words that kind of cracked me open. And the important piece here is that these vows are not at all about being perfect. Contained within them is the notion that, perfection is not really possible, but we'll try anyways. I began to realize that practice wasn't really about just getting good at meditation. Showing up is the practice, not any predetermined attainment or destination. As Dogen has said, Zazen is not learning to do concentration. It is the Dharma gate of great ease and joy. It is undefiled practice, enlightenment. Practice is enlightenment. And having ADHD, struggling with focus, and what Roshi Shinko calls mental storms, I always love that term. This was really a glimmer of hope for me. If I kept showing up, that might be enough. Spirituality wasn't about making myself perfect. You can contrast this to my experience of guilt and shame in the confessional booth. I left that first retreat with a sense that I would take the path of Zen. I still wasn't sure how, but I knew I needed to work with a teacher. So later on, I spent a period of residency at Zen Mountain Monastery, and it was really difficult. It was emotional, it was beautiful, it was meaningful, but mostly it was difficult. My first night there put me face to face with my own rigid expectations. I remember we went out to celebrate some residents' last night there, and many of the monks were drinking, eating red meat, they were smoking cigarettes, they were cracking awful jokes. And this was not my picture of Buddhist monks, right? I expect them to be all serene, with their bowls, going around, just not doing any of the things that they were doing. And I remember asking one monk about, smoking, and he was a smoker, and if it didn't somehow break the precepts or something. And his answer really stuck with me. He said, "What are we if not inconsistent?" And that pointed me right face to face with my own judgment and expectation. In my mind, there's a code. We must follow it to the letter. Yeah, that's my old conditioning speaking, right? But is that true? And so, this both was very startling to me of oh God, this is not at all what I thought it was. And also sort of opened this door of, well, maybe I'm thinking about this wrong. So while I was at ZMM, I struggled with physical pain, mental anguish, self-doubt. I did not feel like I could do this practice, and I hated myself for my difficulties. Every night I felt a glimmer of hope with the Bodhisattva vows. It's impossible, but keep going. And I try again the next day, as best I could. During that first session, I relived all the pains of my childhood. I wavered between self-torment at my poor concentration and periods of deep darkness, anger, and sadness. I cried more in that week than I had in years. In all of my despair and anguish, though, a moment of curiosity spontaneously emerged somewhere near the end of session. And it told me to examine my pain, to focus on it without that self-pity. I found that the more I looked at it, the less threatening it became. My sore legs grew lighter. I looked for where the pain started, and I couldn't find it. I looked for who was experiencing the pain. There was nothing there. And hot tears rolled down my cheeks then, and there's no me to suffer. There's no me screwing up. And that was the first moment in my adult life that I had felt a really true sense of peace. At ZMM, they have a tradition of closing sessions with an open floor for people to share their experience. And it's not unlike what we do here. The only difference is it's not a circle and it's kind of popcorn style. So, you know, people will really speak when they feel like they need to. And I had people from across the Zendo who had looked so put together. You know, they were just sitting like rocks. And they talked about their pain and their struggle and their hardship. And there was such, you know, emotion in how they talked about it. And I realized how alone I had felt in that Zazen. And I was so self-focused. I never realized other people around me were having somewhat of a similar experience. I assumed no one else was having any difficulties, which not only caught me off from myself, but from other people. I felt so touched in that moment that we were truly taking this path together. And it's okay that it's hard. My heart was full of love in witnessing that shared struggle. This, I hope, underlines the value of a talk like this. And it's not because I have any special insight or wisdom from these years of practice, but we sit on our own cushions and we do our practice alone. At times it can feel isolating, especially now as we are practicing remotely. And at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned how for me, Zen is largely about intimacy and vulnerability. And being in the Zendo at ZMM, it was so much different than the shame and isolation of the confessional. The confessional was private. We didn't get to know each other's sins and struggles. Not knowing that other people struggled is what led to deep feelings of shame. And vulnerability with the Sangha would become more of what we really are, unified. Just a bunch of bodhisattvas helping each other along this sometimes pretty shitty path. So, my journey in Zen has been largely a journey towards self-acceptance, which really ultimately leads to acceptance of others. And it's the ground upon which my practice as a psychotherapist rests. The famous psychotherapist Carl Rogers is famous for saying, "The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. When you don't accept yourself, you actually invest in the story of yourself. You're saying, that's me always." The license we give ourselves to make mistakes and keep showing up anyways is then a gift we get to share with others. And that's what I get to do with clients every day. It's beautiful. Keep messing up, it's okay. Now, as I put together this talk, I was kind of struck by how many instances of tears and crying that I shared. And in addition to the tears in my eyes as I wrote this, and there have been some welling up in my eyes as I speak to some of this. As it turns out, I've cried an awful lot in Zen. And it occurs to me now that the tears are not bad or good. Tears for sadness, tears for hurt, tears of joy, tears of beauty. I don't regret my life, which has brought me to you on this day. None of it. So in a lot of ways, my difficult early years prepared me well for the work I do now. Being a therapist is largely just about bearing witness to someone else's suffering and not shying away. We join our clients in the trenches of their lives, one clinical hour at a time. Bearing witness to my own suffering has helped me connect to others. And for this talk, I share this part of my story because I hope it speaks to how deeply Zen has touched my life. But mostly because I want you to have space for your own struggle and imperfections when we're in this together. And that is the biggest gift that Zen has given me, is that understanding that we're in this together. So I don't speak here tonight with any notions of having arrived or having really fully dealt with that karma. Practice never stops. And that's part of what's beautiful about Zen. Often when we think of practice, we think of reaching a goal or making some performance. I spent a lot of my life as a musician, so that sort of logic is really ingrained in me. Got to practice for the show. Practice in a lot of our minds has direction, but in Zen we never stop practicing. It's kind of always the show, right? We're always there. As the vows say, Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. My life is my practice. So as I get ready to kind of close here, I really love Dharma names. I think it's such a beautiful tradition that we have, in particular because it's the teacher seeing something in you, and there's a lot of mystery around what Dharma names mean or what they're amplify, and I'm sure every teacher has a slightly different idea of what they're up to when they give a name. But and I love kind of trying to figure out each of yours and why is that for you. When I teach Jukai many years ago, I was given the name Tangen. And one interpretation of those characters is mysterious smile. And I can't help but think that the smile my teacher saw is the smile of that child who once lived with so much zest and gusto, who didn't really give a shit about conventions or the right way to do things, who asked people impudent questions, unconcerned about social norms and expectations. And I thought for a long time that child was lost to the trials of my early years. And I grieved for that lost vivacity. It felt almost like a different person. Where I'm at now, I don't grieve for him anymore. And I smile for you today. Thanks.